Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Hira Mustafa and these are the headlines. Australia's Victoria State has detected Delta COVID-19 variant for the first time in the capital Melbourne, while India has logged more than 132,000 cases and over 2,700 new fatalities overnight. In Pakistan, the virus has claimed 83 more lives and infected nearly 1,900 people in the past 24 hours. Globally, there are more than 3.6 million deaths and over 172 million cases. China has called on the U.S. to withdraw a ban on investments in dozens of Chinese firms with alleged ties to the military. In a press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Beijing strongly condemns the move. Earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order banning investment in 59 Chinese firms, including Huawei. The U.S. says it expects more than 6 rounds of talks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. In a briefing, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said distrust and the indirect nature of discussions are major hurdles. Yesterday, Iran and the EU voiced optimism that the next session in Vienna will likely to be the conclusive one. In Afghanistan, the Taliban claimed to have killed 8 Afghan soldiers after conquering a military base in Jaujan province. A spokesperson says 13 troops were arrested and 3 Taliban wounded in the attack in Faizabad district. The Afghan government has not commented on the claim so far. Well, those were the headlines. News in detail coming after the short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now the news in detail. Australia's Victoria State has detected the Delta COVID-19 variant for the first time in the capital, Melbourne, while India has logged more than 132,000 cases and over 2,700 new fatalities overnight. Globally, there are more than 3.6 million deaths and over 172 million cases.
As the global COVID-19 vaccination drive hits a snag, the IMF and the World Bank have urged the G7 economies to send excess jabs to the developing countries. The U.S. has announced plans to share a stockpile of 25 million unused doses with the world. Guatemala's president says the U.S. will supply 500,000 doses to the Central American country, while Mexico says Washington has pledged 1 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. Meanwhile, U.S. Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also vowed to distribute the jabs on a priority basis.
We're sharing them in a wide range of countries within Latin America and the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia, and across Africa in coordination with the African Union. This includes prioritizing our neighbors here in our hemisphere, including countries like Guatemala and Colombia, Peru and Ecuador, and many others.
In the UK, Public Health England has recorded the highest daily cases since the 26th of March. It has warned that the Delta variant of concern first identified in India is now dominant in Britain. Meanwhile, India continues to face its COVID-induced multifaceted battle.
The major issues we are facing in the process of this vaccination is the lack of availability of vaccination, and the second one is that the process which is conducted, this vaccination process, is a heavy crowded area. So it is the high risk, the people like these disabled people, they are come to the crowd area, and also the availability of the vaccination.
The UAE and Bahrain have made the Pfizer vaccine available as a booster shot for those initially immunized with China's Sinopharm. Officials say the Democratic Republic of Congo is facing a third wave, with its epicenter in the capital, Kinshasa. Meanwhile, the WHO warns that healthcare systems across Africa are far from ready to cope with a fresh surge of infections.
Pakistan has registered 83 more deaths from coronavirus in the past 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the death toll has risen to 21,105. The virus infected nearly 1,900 people overnight. The country has recorded more than 928,000 cases since the pandemic began, while 856,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. The number of active cases has declined to 51,000, with some 3,500 critical. Meanwhile, the country has reported its lowest positivity ratio in 3 months at 3.58%. China has called on the U.S. to withdraw a ban on investments in dozens of Chinese firms with alleged ties to the military. Earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order banning investment in 59 Chinese firms, including Huawei. In a press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Washington has ruthlessly suppressed Chinese companies. Wang said the move hurts not only the rights and interests of Chinese companies, but also those of global investors. Biden's new order goes into effect on August 2. The move expands the scope of a legally flawed Trump-era order. The U.S. says it expects more than 6 rounds of talks to revive the 2050 nuclear deal with Iran. Yesterday, Iran and the EU voiced optimism that the next session in Vienna will likely be the conclusively one. In a briefing, State Department spokesperson Ed Price said distrust and the indirect nature of discussions are major hurdles. He said the past rounds have helped finalize the decisions that Iran must take to resume compliance with the deal.
There is a mutual understanding as to generally what would need to happen. And at the very highest levels, the shorthand is compliance for compliance. Both sides are engaging in this. I can speak for our side, presumably for the Iranian side too, because they are willing to entertain the proposition of returning to compliance.
Iran has expressed dismay with the suspension of its voting rights at the UN General Assembly. The UN earlier penalized Tehran, Bangui and Mogadishu for not paying dues to the body's operational budget. In a letter to the UN Secretary General, Iran's Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif called the decision unjustified and unacceptable. Zarif said Iran's inability to pay the dues stems from the unilateral sanctions US has imposed on Tehran. Meanwhile, a Foreign Ministry spokesperson says Iran will soon pay its financial contribution to the United Nations. In Afghanistan, the Taliban claimed to have killed 8 Afghan soldiers after conquering a military base in Jozjan province. A spokesperson said 13 troops were arrested and 3 Taliban wounded in the attack in Faizabad district. The militants said they also recovered 23 Kalashnikov rifles, 3 rocket launchers and other ammunition. Meanwhile, the Afghan Defense Ministry says the forces have killed 15 Taliban and wounded 8 others in Zabul province. In a tweet, it said a hideout and some ammunition were also destroyed during the operation in Shahjoy district. Neither the Afghan government nor the fighters have commented on each other's claims so far. France has suspended joint military operations with Mali forces after the country's second army coup in 9 months. In a statement, France's Armed Forces Ministry said it awaits guarantees that civilians will return to positions of power in Bamako. It said the decision taken after consulting Mali's authorities and military will be reassessed in the coming days. Earlier, French President Emmanuel Macron threatened to pull troops out of Mali if political instability continues. The military detained and ousted the interim leaders on May 25th, derailing a transition to democracy. The Economic Community of the West African States and the African Union have suspended Mali and threatened sanctions. The U.S. has reaffirmed a promise to uphold Israel's security, terming the commitment as ironclad. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made the remarks in a meeting with Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz.
Gantz is visiting the U.S. to request $1 billion replenishment of its air defense system after the recent flare-up with Hamas in Gaza. The defense secretary vowed to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge and fight regional threats. While U.S. security officials promised to help replenish the Iron Dome system, they also pressed Israel to reduce tensions with the Palestinians. This comes as Benjamin Netanyahu faces the prospect of an end to his 12-year run as premier. but Washington has vowed to support whoever leads Israel. Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza have dismissed a change in the Israeli government. They said the nationalist leader, due to replace Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, will likely pursue the same right-wing agenda. Meanwhile, the International Red Cross says residents in Gaza are traumatized after the 11-day escalation.
In Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi's lawyer says the ousted leader has no legal representative listed in the junta's Secrets Act case. Kin Maung Zaw said the Supreme Court had listed all 5 accused as their representative. He voiced concern that there won't be any transparency with the hearing that is scheduled on June 23rd. Meanwhile, Myanmar's Federal National Unity Government has urged the Rohingya to join them in fighting the junta. They have in turn promised to offer justice and citizenship to the persecuted minority. An advocacy group says Myanmar's military has killed 845 people since the February 1st coup. The UN has called on Yemen's Houthis to quickly allow experts to examine an oil tanker abandoned off the country's coast. The tanker is loaded with more than 1 million barrels of crude oil and was seized by the rebels in 2015. The Security Council warned of a growing risk of rupture and a potential environmental, economic, maritime, and humanitarian catastrophe. In a press release, it reiterated that the Houthis are responsible for delaying a technical assessment of the tanker. It noted that the rebels agreed to let UN experts access the tanker last year. The intergovernmental body said it expects this deployment to happen as soon as possible. But on Tuesday, the Houthis said recent talks on the tanker hit a snag, blaming the UN for the collapse. They claim the UN has ruled out most of the agreed maintenance for lack of funding. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons says Syria has likely used chemical weapons 17 times. The head of the watchdog for NATO areas told the UN Security Council that its experts have investigated 77 allegations against Syria. He said the presence of a new chemical agent was found in samples collected in large storage containers. Arias said the declaration submitted by Syria cannot be considered accurate and complete. He said his organization will take up the issue at its next consultations with Syria. Meanwhile, Syria's envoy to UN said finding traces of a chemical agent in a test sample is not enough evidence. In Sudan, thousands of people rallied outside the Prime Minister's office to remember the protesters who were killed 2 years ago. More than 100 people were killed when forces dispersed a sit-in outside the military headquarters in 2019. Demonstrators marched through the streets of Khartoum, calling for the prosecution of those responsible. The current transitional military-civilian government launched an investigation in 2019, but the panel has repeatedly missed deadlines for reporting, angering victims' families and rights groups. In the U.S. state of Minnesota, law enforcement officers in Minneapolis shot dead a suspect wanted for a gun possession charge. This sparked a small protest in a city still rattled by the murder of George Floyd in police custody a year ago. Officials say the subject, who was in a parked car, failed to comply and produced a handgun. They say this resulted in task force members firing upon him. The statement added officers attempted to revive the man, but he was declared dead by paramedics on the scene. A woman who was in the car with the suspect sustained minor injuries from shattered glass. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will lead an investigation into the shooting. More news stories coming up after the short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Canada has promised to direct more resources to address violence against Indigenous women, but gave no time frame. This comes 2 years after a report into the deaths of more than 1,000 Indigenous women and girls in recent decades. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada's systems have failed the Indigenous women. The government promised to give Indigenous communities more control over social services and improve access to health care. The government says it will address systemic racism among the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It is a national law enforcement agency responsible for policing many rural areas in the country. Earlier, the remains of 215 children were found at the site of a former residential school for native children. U.S. intelligence officials have found no evidence that aerial sightings in recent years were alien spacecraft. The New York Times says the phenomena remain unexplained in a highly anticipated government report. It says most of the incidents did not originate from any American military or other advanced U.S. government technology. Many of the 120-plus sightings were reported by U.S. Navy personnel, and some involved foreign militaries. The paper says U.S. officials believe experimental technology of a rival power could account for at least some of the incidents. An unclassified version of the report expected to be submitted to Congress by June 25th. International experts have been deployed to help Sri Lanka contain a potential oil leak from a burnout container ship. The ship, carrying 350 metric tons of oil, has been burning off Colombo for over 14 days and is now partially sunk. The ship's company says foreign experts are coordinating with Sri Lankan authorities on a plan to deal with the possible spill. The company's chief executive also apologized to Sri Lanka for the disaster, which swamped beaches with plastic pellets. Sri Lanka Navy spokesperson said choppy seas and poor visibility prevented Navy divers from checking the hull. Meanwhile, marine protection authorities have placed oil dispersants and skimmers should the vessel leak oil on board. France is sending the U.S. a replica of the historic Statue of Liberty it gifted in 1884 to rekindle the centuries-old friendship. More in this report.
New York's Lady Liberty is set to get a new sister as a French museum plans to send its replica to the United States in time for Independence Day. France sent the first Statue of Liberty, which towers more than 92 meters and weighs 225 tons, to the U.S. in 1886. Prominent French figures, including engineer Gustave Eiffel, the brainchild of the Eiffel Tower, and architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who also worked on Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, were involved in the statue's construction.
This cast is in a 1/16th scale, meaning the Statue of Liberty is exactly 16 times bigger than this cast, and it depicts all the elements that you see. The torch, meaning liberty illuminating the world. So you do have the sculpture cast created by Bartholdi that served as a model to create New York sculpture.
Museum director Marie-Laure Estignard said both the original and the replica symbolizes the French and American friendship. It is expected to arrive at the capital around July 14th, marking France's National Day. The replica will then be transported to the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. as part of a 10-year loan.
This replica will depart on June 7 from here. I think it will arrive in New York on July 4th, the date of American Independence Day. And then it will arrive in Washington, D.C. on July 14th, which is French National Day. So we are well commemorating the history of French-American friendship by respecting the dates on the statues.
It is one of the biggest tourist attractions in the United States, which welcomed 4 million people yearly before the COVID-19 era.
In Bolivia, indigenous women are learning martial arts to fight back against domestic violence. Details in this report.
In their distinctive billowing skirts and bowler hats, the Aymara women in Bolivia's highlands are taking Taekwondo classes to learn self-defense. These indigenous Cholita women belonging to the high-altitude cities of La Paz and El Alto have long faced discrimination. The training is a part of a female empowerment drive by the Warmi Power Project.
I have suffered a lot. That's why I am now practicing self-defense. What is self-defense practice for? It is to defend myself from the blows and kicks in the face, from the fists that hit me in the eyes until they almost explode. Men are not afraid of hitting women. They don't think that by hitting us and mistreating us, they hurt us physically. That is why we live in a great fear. I have suffered a lot of physical and psychological abuses since I was a child. Up to now that I am an older woman, I have always suffered a lot.
The self-defense classes are taught free of charge by instructors from the Warmi Power Project, which says it has already reached some 20,000 Bolivian women.
Lo que les enseñamos son técnicas.
We teach them basic techniques to escape aggression so that they can defend themselves from any aggression. We also want to empower them. We want to bring out all the strength that they have. Our workshops look at psychology, attitude, and emotions to empower women to be able to stop certain aggressions. So women can recognize when they are in a situation of violence, a toxic relationship, and can stop violence before it occurs and reaches a femicide.
UN Women data shows 8 out of 10 Bolivian women suffer some type of violence during their lifetime. This year, Bolivian authorities have already tailed 48 femicides, mostly by partners or husbands of the victims.
European stocks have inched higher in cautious trading ahead of U.S. jobs data. The economic recovery hopes are putting the main index on course for its third straight week of gains. The Pan-European Stock 600 index edged up, trading just below its record high hit earlier this week. Both the French CAC and Germany's DAX edged higher, while the FTSE 100 lagged behind its continental peers as investors digested the UK's review of the traffic light system for the international travel. Now it's time to have a look at the weather update across the globe. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.